Oh, the fun is getting started again. With his environmental policy U-turn, British Prime Minister Sunak is suddenly showing himself to be a climate terror. It is a devastating signal, though. If only he had listened better to Boris Johnson, doesn't he? You can think what you want about Boris Johnson, but his climate policy was anything but wrong. After Brexit, the former Prime Minister focused on making Great Britain a net zero role model. Even if some announcements, such as the construction of dozens of new nuclear plants, were quite unrealistic, Johnson still stood for a country that banned the sale of new petrol and diesel cars 5 years earlier than the EU. The fact that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is now carelessly given up on this climate policy ambition is the biggest mistake of his term in office so far. And it was a real surprise. Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of Great Britain, revised the ambitious climate policy of his predecessor Boris Johnson last Wednesday. The statutory target for the UK to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 remains, though. But the rapid pace at which the so-called net zero was supposed to be achieved compared to other countries no longer applies. The sale of new diesel and petrol cars should not be banned in 2030 but only in 2035, as in the EU and several US states. The sale of new oil and gas burners in private homes will not be banned until 2035 rather than 26. Sunak unveiled the changes on Wednesday in a speech he brought forward after the policy shift was previously reported by the BBC. Sunak is doing this for good reasons. He has found that many citizens are unwilling to accept the costs and lifestyle changes involved in combating climate change. That's why he's now creating a new election campaign issue with the environment. A new general election must take place in the United Kingdom by the end of next year, the beginning of the year after at the latest. So far, the Conservative Party has lagged far behind the Labour opposition in voter polls. But the issue of the environment could help. In July, the Conservatives surprisingly won a by-election in the constituency of Uxbridge, that's a suburb of London. During the election campaign, they attacked the green environmental policy of London Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan, and Sunak is now taking advantage of the experience that environmental policy can win votes. The majority want global warming to be stopped there. There is no point in formulating ambitious policies without telling the people honestly what these policies cost, Sunak said on Thursday, taking a swipe at Johnson's environmental policies. He now wants to be honest. That will be a first. We cannot expect families to have to pay up to £15,000 for a new heat pump in the middle of the inflation and cost crisis when that is not even necessary, he said. Politics must be pragmatic and convince the public. Yeah, but he means populist. The Prime Minister says Britain can afford to relax the policy. The United Kingdom has historically reduced its emissions faster than comparable other developed countries, according to Sunak. That's true if you look at the balance sheet since 1990. And finally, the UK shut down its coal mines and coal-fired power stations and stuck to nuclear energy. In addition, there are fewer energy-consuming industries in the United Kingdom than, for example, here in Germany. They don't have real industry. Since 2015, Germany has reduced its emissions faster than Great Britain. The British Prime Minister is also accommodating house and apartment owners with his changes. The time pressure to renovate properties in an environmentally friendly manner should be eliminated. At the same time, the subsidies for heat pumps will increase from the current £5,000 and £6,000 to £7,500. However, in order to make his change of course clear, Sunak also announced changes that were not changes at all, because he claimed additional taxes on flights, I deleted them. Taxes on meat, I deleted them. Separating waste into 7 containers, I deleted them. Well, in reality, these were not existing regulations at all, but rather proposals for discussion by the Independent Commission for Climate Change. And we have a lot of different containers here in Germany, by the way. Sunak's new policy is a response to a prevailing attitude among most British people. According to a survey by the analysis company YouGov, The majority of the public wants global warming to be stopped and emissions to be reduced, but many are not willing to dig deep into their own pockets or change their lives. They don't want to give up vacation flights, continue to eat meat, drive their car alone, and maybe buy an electric car later, if at all. And a poll published in the Daily Mail newspaper showed that half of the public and the majority of Tory voters support Sunak's new course. Sunak wants to achieve two things in terms of election tactics. On the left, he demarcates his politics against Labour, the Liberals and the Greens. In the eyes of many voters, these parties stand for climate policy and for supporting the hated Stop Oil environmental demonstrators. On the right wing of his party, Sunak is appeasing all the conservatives who do not believe in expensive environmental policy and who therefore elected Sunak's predecessor, the Thatcherite politician Liz Truss, as Prime Minister. The political shift is also well received by the working class, which was enthusiastic about Brexit and Boris Johnson in 2019, but is now threatening to vote for the far-right Reform Party. But the U-turn is also met with criticism. In one fell swoop, Sunak has driven a wedge into the Conservative Party, which is now arguing over climate policy. Former Environment Minister and former chair of the COP26 conference, Alok Sharma, posted on increased costs for consumers. And Sharma is currently attending the UN climate conference in New York, where the British government's move caused quite a surprise, as you can put it. And Johnson's former Environment Minister, Zac Goldsmith, said about this, "The change of course is a scandal. It means that other countries will now also withdraw their climate targets." Goldsmith had already accused Sunak this year of not having the slightest interest in environmental issues. The change of course is not even democratically legitimized. There needs to be a new election. In fact, Sunak overturned the climate targets without there being any discussion in Parliament. Parliament is in recess due to the upcoming party conferences. In contrast to Johnson, Sunak was not even elected but was elevated to the office of Prime Minister by the party. And Sunak's announcement also sparked surprise and criticism from the business community. Our industry needs three things: ambition, execution and consistency. That was said by Ford UK chairman Lisa Brankin. The change of course away from 2030 undermines all three goals, she says. The automotive industry in Great Britain is currently preparing for the strict requirements that Johnson's policies had imposed on the industry. According to this, automotive companies in Great Britain would have had to sell up to 22% of their sales as electric cars in the coming year in order to avoid hefty fines. And this share should increase steadily until 2030. But not all automobile manufacturers could keep up, especially not Toyota and JLR, that's Jaguar Land Rover. They welcomed the easing of the policy. However, other companies have invested significantly with a view to 2030, such as BMW. Just 10 days ago, the Munich-based company announced that it wanted to invest £600 million in a mini factory near Oxford and a factory in Swindon, so that only electric versions of the Mini would be manufactured in them from 2030. The investment is subsidized by the British government to the tune of £75 million. And BMW's decision was hailed by the post-Brexit government as a milestone for the industry. And now Sunak is throwing the calculation out the window. The pressure on consumers to change is easing, and this means that fewer electric cars will be purchased immediately. This in turn means that the forecasts of sales figures for the industry and its investment no longer works. But for Sunak this is secondary. He hopes to increase his election chances. The Daily Telegraph, an important newspaper for Conservative voters, has already rejoiced. Sunak is sparing the public net zero pain. The Daily Mail tabloid quoted Sunak, "I'm sparing families the ruinous cost of net zero." And the Daily Express agreed. "Honest Rishi, the nation will not and cannot pay the net zero bill." Well, this is how Sunak opened the election campaign. A flash poll by the polling institute YouGov shows that Sunak could actually be successful. 50% of the adults surveyed said they supported the eventual phase-out of combustion engines. 34% were in favor of the current schedule. Nevertheless, hurdles remain for Sunak, especially since Conservative voters also generally support more climate protection. The new date for the ban on combustion engines must also be confirmed by Parliament. It will be exciting to see how great the internal resistance is. And former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who liked to portray himself as the foremost climate protector, also criticized his intimate enemy Sunak. There's also likely to be legal trouble. According to climate change portal Carbon Brief, Britain could miss its binding carbon budget for the period 2033 to 37. In short, this is a gamble for Mr. Sunak, commented the BBC. But a Prime Minister who is miles behind his opponents and facing a vote has no choice but to bet, they said. And the former Prime Minister and Sunak's party colleague Boris Johnson criticized that companies should have certainty about the country's climate neutrality goals. We cannot afford to cave now, Johnson said, according to a statement. Johnson had prescribed ambitious climate targets for his country, which his successors are now gradually abandoning. The issue is likely to play a major role at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester at the beginning of October. Sunak denied the move was primarily a response to poor poll numbers for his party, which is expected to face the general election next year. But the suspicion is that he is primarily hoping for votes with the measure. In the case of the victory of the Sunak's Tories in the by-election to Johnson's former London constituency in July, the opposition to the expansion of the ULEZ low-emission zone by London Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan was considered decisive. Sky News reporter Beth Rigby also described Sunak's speech as the start of a very long election campaign. The energy policy spokesman for the opposition Labour Party, which is leading Sunak's Conservatives by a wide margin in the polls, announced that Labour would stick to the current date for phasing out combustion engines if it wins the general election expected next year. But talking about Johnson, let's not forget about Johnson's past either in this context. And something funny came up now. According to a report, British government employees asked Buckingham Palace for help due to chaotic conditions in the government headquarters Downing Street during the corona pandemic. In the spring of 2020, senior employees hoped that the late Queen Elizabeth II could remind the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson of his duties. That's what the BBC reported on Monday. His behavior in office had therefore caused concern. It remained unclear whether the Queen complied with the request in her weekly conversations with Johnson. Among other things, the Prime Minister had to be reminded of the Constitution, as the BBC quoted an unnamed sources saying. The atmosphere at government headquarters was deeply bitter and completely crazy, and the relationship between Johnson's team and the civil service collapsed, as the report said. And I can imagine. There are said to have been arguments between Johnson's then chief advisor Dominic Cummings and the top official Marc, who subsequently resigned from his position. Cummings, who later fell out with Johnson, made no secret of his view of the officials as incompetent. He also accused them of wanting to sabotage Britain's exit from the EU. But Sunak has more problems at the moment than just Boris Johnson anyway. Sentiment in UK businesses also fell to its lowest level since January 21 in September. The S&P Global Purchasing Managers Index fell by 1.8 points to 46.8 points compared to the previous month, as S&P announced on Friday in London based on an initial estimate. On average, economists had expected a slight increase to 48.7. The indicator is moving further away from the growth threshold of 50 points, and this signals a contraction in the economy. The overall index was negatively impacted by the significant fall in the services indicator. It fell by 2.3 points to 47.2. The service sector is particularly large in Great Britain, and the value for industry, however, rose by 1.2 points to 44.2. The disappointing results of the September survey mean that a recession in the UK is becoming increasingly likely. That's how Chris Williamson, chief economist at S&P Global, commented on this. The downturn is becoming more widespread and there's little hope for an early improvement. And I included this because one thing Sunak is doing with his announcements on climate change is covering stories on a lot of other things happening, and that's why I also bring those in a video when I talk about this overburdening climate change thing. And if you want to see something else right now, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.